In spring 1943, 133 young men set out on the most daring and ingenious bombing raid in history. To destroy the great dams of Germany using bombs that bounce.
Look at the way it's skipping across the surface of the water there.
If successful, they'll deal a hammer blow to the Nazi war effort. They're led by this man, Guy Gibson. He's only 24, but he's already one of the most famous and highly decorated pilots in the world. I'm Dan Snow, and over 3 programs, I'm charting the nail-biting countdown to the mission. In less than 2 months, 617 will be the most famous squadron number in RAF history. This time, we follow Guy Gibson, as he's given just 60 days to form a crack squadron and secretly train them to fly their bombers on the edge of what's possible.
This is really low.
While maverick inventor Barnes Wallis struggles to make his revolutionary weapon work.
Barnes Wallis groans, "Oh my God."
This is the story of the single mission that can change the course of the Second World War. These are the Dam Busters. St Vincent's Hall, Lincolnshire. Headquarters of Bomber Command's 5 Group. The top secret nerve centre from where night after night the British are orchestrating the aerial bombardment of German cities. It's early on Thursday the 18th of March, and Wing Commander Guy Gibson is arriving here at HQ for the 4th morning in a row.
Guy Gibson has no idea why he's here at headquarters. He's not happy about it. It doesn't suit him. It's full of cold, efficient-looking men marching around these corridors with red folders under their arms. He is a frontline bomber pilot, far more used to the adrenaline-fueled life of a wartime squadron.
In fact, Gibson shouldn't be here at all. He should be on his way to Cornwall with his wife for a much-needed spot of leave. He's just completed his 3rd tour and has now flown over 150 dangerous missions. He's already defied the odds. Very few RAF aircrew survive 2 tours. After days hanging around at HQ, Gibson is finally called to wait here outside the office of Air Vice Marshal Sir Ralph Cochrane, the 2nd most senior officer in Bomber Command.
Gibson walks in here into what was Cochrane's office. Cochrane's in here and congratulates him on his latest gallantry award. Then he says, "How do you feel about one more flight?" Well, Gibson knew full well that he's completed more than his designated number of flights. He's spent years dealing with the anxiety caused of night bombing raids, seeing his friends die around him, other aircraft crashing to the ground in fireballs. He's aware that his own survival is something of a miracle. So, not surprisingly, he's less than enthusiastic about this one more flight.
When Guy Gibson walked into Ralph Cochrane's office and was asked if he'd do one more mission, he was already a legend. Now, some so-called war heroes, you can be a bit iffy about whether they were the real thing. Gibson was the real thing. Incredibly courageous. A lot of the men who served under him hated his guts, but incredibly brave, incredibly determined.
Gibson was really suffering from burnout. He was struggling with this mental strain of having to carry out so many operations, so many sorties, and finally being told, "Here's one more for you."
We know that standing in this office, Gibson's head was full of concerns and emotion, and yet all he actually said was, "What kind of trip, sir?" Cochrane replied, "Pretty important one. Perhaps one of the most devastating of all time. I can't tell you any more now, but are you keen to do it?" Gibson, remarkably, thought he was being asked to go on a raid that very night. And so, despite all his reservations, he says he was pretty sure he was up for it, but he hadn't brought any of his flying kit.
Cochrane tells him this is no ordinary raid. It's possibly the most important mission of the war so far, and Gibson will need to form and train a special squadron to carry it out.
Cochrane impresses upon Gibson the sense of urgency. This highly secret, very dangerous raid needs to take place in under 2 months' time. Gibson asks about training or about the target, and Cochrane says, "I can't tell you any more than that at the moment, I'm afraid." So that was that.
Just 3 days later, Guy Gibson arrives here at RAF Scampton. It's one of the dozens of airfields that pepper the flat lands of Lincolnshire. This is the epicenter of Britain's huge heavy bomber offensive. Putting this base at the cutting edge of Britain's entire war effort.
Between June 1940, when the British Army was kicked out of France, and June 1944, when it went back with the Americans, most of the British Army was training in Britain. And for those 4 years, the bomber offensive was the most important thing Britain was doing to carry the war to Germany. Churchill embarked on it when he could see no other way of defeating Germany than a bomber offensive.
RAF Scampton hasn't changed much since that Sunday afternoon Gibson arrived here in March 1943. This was to be the home of the new secret squadron he'd been ordered to create from scratch. There hadn't even been time to issue it an official name, so for now, it was known as Squadron X.
So Gibson has got to recruit 21 crack bomber crews into a squadron with no name and no aircraft for a terribly dangerous mission. And he's got just a few days to do it. The clock is ticking.
Guy Gibson, the young commander of the newly formed Squadron X, now has less than 8 weeks to recruit and train 147 aircrew. He moves in here to the now derelict officers' mess at RAF Scampton. It's also home to the bomber crews of 57 Squadron.
Dining room would have been just behind here, and it's into this dining room that Guy Gibson comes for breakfast that morning in March 1943, and all around him are aircrew of 57 Squadron who are engaged in the nightly battle over occupied Europe, bombing enemy targets. He obviously likes what he sees because he manages to recruit 5 57 Squadron aircrew into his brand new squadron.
Gibson knew that he would need very special airmen. They were going to have to be very brave, and they were going to have to be very skillful, because flying a heavy bomber, people don't understand the physical demands that flying this huge airplane makes.
In addition to the crews of 57 Squadron, Gibson phones up and recruits some of the best pilots in Bomber Command. But he needs a total of 21 pilots to make up his new squadron, and he can't hand-pick them all.
So the myth is that the entire squadron, Squadron X as she is at the moment, was made up of specialist, highly elite RAF pilots selected by Guy Gibson himself. Not necessarily the case.
There were very veteran, very experienced pilots with lots of decorations, but there were some very junior crews as well, some of which had only flown 2 or 3 missions.
Squadron commanders didn't want to send him their best crews. They attempted to send him 1 or 2 absolutely hopelessly duff crews whom they wanted to get rid of. Also, as soon as people hear about a special operation, they're terrified. Anybody who's in Bomber Command realizes that he's already in a business that is likely to kill him. And yet here is somebody coming along now and said, how would you like to come and join a special squadron that's going to do something that nobody's ever done before? Well, they had a lot of trouble finding volunteers for that.
Only a couple of days after Gibson's arrival at Scampton, he's joined by the first of his recruits. They include aircrew from Canada, New Zealand and Australia, who'll eventually make up around a third of the squadron. One of them is 23-year-old Les Munro, a tall sheep farmer's son from New Zealand, with 17 missions under his belt. Big Les had seen the request for volunteers pinned on his squadron notice board and volunteered with his crew.
The day that Les Munro arrives on the base here, he meets the other recruits in the officers' mess for a beer. He looks around and he realizes immediately something's up. He's never seen so many gallantry awards, DSOs, DFCs, on the chests of the young men around him. He realizes that if all of these star aircrew have been brought together, it must be a very, very challenging target. While the new recruits are gathering for a few beers here at the officers' mess, the RAF finally gives the new squadron its number, 617. At the time, it was just the next available number, but in less than 2 months, it will be the most famous squadron number in RAF history.
But while they may now have a number, no one on the new squadron knows what they've been brought together to do. Not even the squadron commander, Guy Gibson. Six days after agreeing to lead the mission, Gibson is driven to a smart Surrey golf club requisitioned for the war. All he knows is that he'll be meeting a scientist who's working on a secret project it's hoped will land a devastating blow on Nazi Germany. The scientist is Barnes Wallis, a senior designer for aircraft manufacturer Vickers.
As Barnes Wallis prepares to meet Guy Gibson for the first time, the quietly spoken 55-year-old father of 4 must have wondered what kind of man this squadron commander would be. Then in walks Guy Gibson, 24 years old, egotistical, heroic, bombastic, a charismatic leader of men. They're from different worlds. One, a man of action, the other, a man of ideas, a blue sky thinker. But they strike up the most unlikely of friendships, based on mutual respect and admiration.
We might think that this is a meeting of 2 opposites, and to a certain extent it is. But war had a habit of bringing different people together for a common front. Both of these individuals are sitting down and realizing that in fact they have a common objective, which is to win the war.
Barnes Wallis is one of Britain's most respected aircraft designers. Now he's also developing a precision weapon he believes can devastate Germany's industry. If the Nazis' production lines of tanks, planes and armaments can be disrupted, the war can be brought to an early end.
As Gibson and Wallis meet for the first time, Wallis looks around to make sure no one's listening, and then says, "I'm very glad you've come. I don't suppose you know what it's for?" Gibson replies, "No idea, I'm afraid." To which Wallis said, "What? You mean they haven't told you the target?" That makes things awkward. Very awkward.
The secrecy around the mission is so tight, Wallace is only allowed to reveal the target to a small number of people on an approved list. Gibson isn't on it. But Wallace can reveal the weapon 617 Squadron will be using. In his office, he shows Gibson something extraordinary. It's top-secret test footage of a revolutionary new bomb he's designing.
This is the actual footage that Barnes Wallis showed Guy Gibson of his prototype bomb. There it goes, being dropped by a bomber. The bouncing bomb. Look at the way it's skipping across the surface of the water there.
This footage was filmed 2 months earlier. The successful test of Wallace's small-scale prototype bouncing bomb helped convince the RAF top brass to back what some considered a madcap project.
Barnes Wallis had been working on this idea for years, and he was convinced this demonstrated that it was practical. If you drop the bomb at the right height, the right speed, it would skip along the surface of the water before coming to a stop right next to the intended target. On this occasion, it bounced around 20 times before coming to rest after travelling 3/4 of a mile.
Gibson must have been absolutely astounded when he saw the film. The moment of revelation when it hits the water and there's a plume of spray, but then this weapon emerges from the spray and continues to bounce along the surface of the water. What on earth is all this about?
It's said Barnes Wallis first came up with the idea for his bouncing bomb as he skipped stones across the water with his family at Chesil Beach in Dorset. He then began experimenting in his back garden, using a tin bath, a catapult, and his children's marbles.
Engineers often will start with something very small, like a marble, which doesn't seem to have any relation to bouncing a bomb. But actually, you can learn a lot from a very small test.
Just 11 months previously, Barnes Wallis was playing with marbles with his kids. Now he's showing Guy Gibson this film. Trouble is, he can't tell Guy Gibson what the target is. He just has to tell him that there are many targets within Germany that could be destroyed with the right amount of high explosives placed very accurately, and this is the most reliable way of doing it. The problem is, bouncing bombs require you to be flying at high speed, at ultra-low level, above water, at night. Nothing like it has ever been done before.
Wallace asks Gibson if he thinks his squadron is capable of delivering a full-sized bouncing bomb to an as yet undisclosed target. Gibson coolly replies, "It'll be difficult, but worth a try." He assumes they'll be attacking the fortified submarine pens on the French coast, or the great German battleship Tirpitz that's anchored in the heavily defended Norwegian fjord. Ideal targets for a bouncing bomb, but near suicidal for the bomber crews. Back at Scampton, Gibson summons the crews he's so far recruited to a meeting, here in the huge aircraft hangar that's to be their new home.
The crews of 617 Squadron gather here in this main hangar at Scampton. Guy Gibson jumps on the bonnet of a car and gives a speech. He tells them the mission they've been selected for is dangerous. The odds are heavily stacked against them. If any of them wish to withdraw, they are free to do so. Given that, there will be no stigma if they choose to walk away. They will not be branded cowards or having lack of moral fibre, as the RAF put it. He waited. Not a single person moved. No one took up his offer.
The crews are about to begin intensive training. They must learn to fly and navigate at extreme low levels. They'll take to the air day and night until it's second nature.
If I tell you to fly through hangar doors, Gibson tells them, then you will do so, even if your wingtips brush either side.
Discipline and total secrecy are paramount. So all leave is cancelled. But 21-year-old bomb aimer Johnny Johnson, a farm worker's son from Lincolnshire, is due to get married in a week's time in Devon. Johnson is part of pilot Joe McCarthy's crew, who's the only American in the squadron.
Joe McCarthy was massively respected, massively adored by his men. He was this big, blonde, strapping American who sort of used a few expletives and profanities that some of the perhaps more pursed-lipped Brits weren't quite used to.
When he hears all leave is cancelled and Johnny Johnson will miss his wedding, Joe McCarthy is furious. He marches his entire crew up the stairs and along this corridor to confront the squadron commander.
McCarthy knocks on the door of Gibson's office. This was Gibson's office, and now it's been restored just how it was back in the spring of 1943. McCarthy storms in here and he is in forceful form. He points out that his crew have completed their tour. They deserve some leave. And what's more, his bomb aimer is supposed to be getting married on the 3rd of April, and he is getting married on the 3rd of April. Uncharacteristically, Gibson gives in, sort of. He allows McCarthy's crew 4 days of leave.
Johnny Johnson travels to his fiancée, Gwyn's hometown of Torquay. On the 3rd of April, they're married in her local church, with Gwyn wearing a dress she's borrowed because of clothes rationing. Almost immediately, Johnson has to return to Scampton to fly an incredibly dangerous mission, knowing Gwyn may never see him again. "11 days after agreeing to lead a top-secret mission, Guy Gibson is once again ordered here to Bomber Command 5 Group headquarters in Grantham. He now knows he'll be using Barnes-Wallis's revolutionary bouncing bomb, but still has no idea what he'll be dropping it on.
Gibson returns here to the office of Air Vice Marshal Cochrane. Now, once that door is safely closed, Cochrane points to 3 large packing crates on the floor in here and gives him a screwdriver. Inside these crates, he tells Gibson, are targets that he's going to be expected to destroy. Gibson opens the crates and feels a great wave of relief because inside them he doesn't find models of some huge battleship or U-boat pens. Instead, each crate contains an intricately carved model of a landscape, hills surrounding a reservoir. At the head of each reservoir, a giant dam.
Gibson's mission is to attack the great dams of Germany. The primary target is the Mona Dam. It's 130 feet high and nearly half a mile long. When built in 1913, it was the biggest dam in Europe. Together with the other targets, the Zorpa and Eder dams, it supplies much of the water and hydroelectric power needed in Germany's industrial heartland, the Ruhr Valley.
The big dams, which were located within the Ruhr Valley and around the Ruhr Valley, were so important to the German war machine because the Ruhr was considered the armory of the Reich. It produced 70% of its raw steel, it produced pig iron, it produced all of these different aspects which were vital to keeping Nazi Germany in the war.
There's a quote from Barnes-Wallis, 150 tons of water is required to make 1 ton of steel. And since steel is so important to the ultimate war effort, why not target the water?
Wallis knew that if those dams could be destroyed, this would cause a devastating blow to Hitler's war machine and production.
The Great Dams aren't just critical to Germany's war machine. They're a source of immense national pride for the Nazis. And the Allies have had them in their sights since the start of the war. In fact, in 1940, before Wallace came up with the idea for a bouncing bomb, he'd asked a group of scientists at the Building Research Station in Hertfordshire to try and work out how the dams could be destroyed.
During the particularly harsh winter of 1940 to 41, scientists built a perfect scale model of the Mona Dam here on the edge of their research facility in Watford. Now, apparently it's still in these woods. I'm going to go and find it.
Secrecy was vital, so only a handful of people knew about the model dam's existence.
I think the slope is going down. I think there's a stream bed in there.
Everyone who worked on the project referred to it as Weir Number 1.
Yeah, here it is. I love it. Look at this. A perfect 1/50th scale model of a German dam across a stream in a wood on the outskirts of Watford.
The scientists here carried out a series of tests to work out how much explosive would be needed to destroy the real Mona Dam.
The initial experiments showed that if you were able to drop a bomb in the water fairly near the dam, but not right up against it, it would require 30,000 pounds of high explosives to make a breach like that. That's the same weight as 10 cars.
But Barnes-Wallis made a crucial discovery. If a bomb detonated right up against the dam wall, much less explosive was needed.
They did work out that 7,000 pounds of high explosives dropped 30 feet down right up against the concrete of the dam wall would breach it.
It was, literally, a massive breakthrough. But how on earth would Wallace be able to get a bomb that close to the wall of the dam? By the end of March, the crews of 617 Squadron still have no idea what their target is. To maintain secrecy, they won't be told until just before the raid, which must take place in less than 7 weeks' time.
They knew that the operation had to take place before the end of the May because they had to attack when the reservoirs were full after the winter rains. And if you attack them when the reservoirs are half empty at summer levels, it's not going to do much harm.
With the May deadline fast approaching, the intense training required for the mission hasn't yet begun. But that's about to change.
The new squadron can now start flying because their new aircraft have finally arrived. And back in 1943, there was only one aircraft capable of completing this mission. And there it is, the Avro Lancaster. A magnificent plane.
This is one of only 17 Lancasters that remain of over 7,000 that were built during the war. The Lancaster might be a brilliant piece of British engineering, but it wasn't designed to carry a single massive bouncing bomb that now has the codename Upkeep.
This remarkable plane needed heavy modification to carry an Upkeep bouncing bomb. The bombs weighed 4 tons, 3 of which was high explosives. They had to strip lots of heavy parts out. They took that turret out, and they also removed a lot of the armour plating on here. They also had to change this bomb bay. They had to pull these off because the Upkeep bomb was so big that it would sit half sticking out of the fuselage of the plane.
Inside, it was a tight fit for the 7 crew members needed to operate the aircraft.
So this is the hatch where the crew would access the Lancaster. Down there, the old rear gunner, Tail End Charlie, armed with machine guns. Not much use against enemy fighters, but for this particular mission, for the Dambusters raid, he'd be aiming at targets on the ground like searchlights and anti-aircraft batteries, having to retrain himself to do that. No upper turret and on the Lancasters that went in the Dambusters because that was been taken out to reduce weight. And we come forward here. Very, very difficult to move around these aircraft, particularly if they're a bit tall like me, but come through now to where the rest of the crew were. Here we go. Whoa. Wireless operator. And then we come forward, we get the navigator right here, looking at his maps, and we come up to the cockpit itself. On these Lancasters in Bomber Command by this period, there was only one pilot. He sat here. There just weren't enough pilots to go around. So high was the loss rate, the attrition rate for pilots. He had armour plating on this chair, try and keep him safe. But if he goes, the whole crew are in big trouble. There was an engineer sat beside the pilot. And then if we go forward into the nose of the aircraft, that's where the bomb aimer lay there. And above him, there would be a forward-facing gunner as well, so that he could engage enemy targets on the ground.
On Wednesday, the 31st of March, the crews of 617 Squadron finally begin their intensive training for the mission. As they climb into their mighty Lancasters, the crew know this mission is going to push the aircraft to its limits. Because the squadron now has to learn to fly at extreme low level to avoid being picked up by German radar and become easy prey for Nazi fighters.
Crews who've won 7 Squadron have flown Lancasters before, but now they're going to have to completely relearn how to fly that aircraft because it was meant to operate at 15 to 20,000 feet. They were now going to fly it at treetop height.
This operation, to be successful, required a number of skills on the part of the pilots. First of all, they had to operate their Lancaster bombers as if they were fighter pilots in fighter planes. But the Lancaster bomber isn't a fighter plane. It isn't designed to fly low. It's designed to drop bombs from a height. So they were actually requiring of that airplane for it to do something which it wasn't created to do.
The low-level flying, it's exhilarating, but it is very challenging. You're flying fast, so the slightest error in concentration or lapse in concentration means that you're very close to the ground. So that you need to be wits about you the whole time in flying your aeroplane when you're at low level.
As bomb aimer Johnny Johnson lies on his front in the Perspex nose of the Lancaster, he has a bird's eye view.
Johnny Johnson loves it, but he's a little bit put off when his American pilot Joe McCarthy flew so low over a field of flowering tulips in Spalding that he ripped up most of the farmer's crop. On another occasion, they were following the line of a canal by Sutton Bridge, and McCarthy took them underneath some high-voltage electricity cables that crossed their path.
Incredibly, there are no accidents, but there are plenty of close scrapes. Some Lancasters even returned from sorties with the tops of trees caught in their rear undercarriage wheel. They're flying on the edge of disaster.
But that was just the beginning. Flying low level was just part of their preparation. They also had to learn how to navigate and drop bombs to within a few feet of a target, all whilst flying at night.
It was almost impossible. Despite only 44 days remaining until the mission deadline, latecomers are still joining 617 Squadron and being thrown into intensive training. The pilots are learning to fly their massive Lancaster bombers at treetop height. And the navigators must master a whole new method of finding their way to the target.
By 1943, Bomber Command's navigation techniques had become a lot better than they were in 1939, but they were still very imperfect. They were going to have to navigate by eye in the moonlight, just by following rivers and following lakes, power lines, and so on. And even though flying in at deck level meant they should escape the night fighters, it also meant they were completely vulnerable to low-level German flak, machine guns, searchlights, and so on.
At low level, the Lancaster's primitive radio navigation system doesn't work. So now the crews begin learning how to thread their way low across occupied Europe and Germany using just a map and a compass. Today, I'm in the navigator's seat of a light aircraft to see what the men had to deal with. Former RAF pilot Graham Duff will be at the controls.
So if you're flying up at 15,000 feet, presumably you can see the coast, you've got the mountains over there, you sort of know where you are, which you don't get when you're at low level. It's all happening pretty fast.
Yeah, so the perspective is totally different. And because things look different, you now need to navigate by different features.
Our destination, the Derwent Reservoir in the Derbyshire Peak District. A training area used by 617 Squadron. Before every flight, the navigators had to plot a series of landmarks on a map, which they used as turning points en route to the target. Miss a turning point, and they could become completely lost. Today, I might not be flying in a Lancaster bomber, but I'm going to try using the same low-level navigation methods as the Dam Busters. But if I get lost, Graham will take over.
This is the exact countryside they flew over at low level. Many of these houses, barns and farms haven't changed much since. There's probably a few people down there that remember the Lancasters going over.
We're going to descend down low level.
Watch out for the trees.
Yeah, trees I reckon about 30 to 50 feet. Now we've got power lines to worry about.
Yeah.
The lowest we're allowed to fly en route is 100 feet, and I'm struggling to locate my first turning point. I've already lost my bearings.
We're about 2 miles east of where on the line, so my timing's going to be a bit off.
Yeah, timing's off.
If 617 Squadron made a similar mistake during the mission, it would likely be fatal.
Life comes at you fast when you're navigating at low level. The landscape opens up, you've got to keep readjusting, reevaluating where you are. Not to mention avoiding electricity pylons.
As we enter the valleys near our target, accurate navigation is vital. The Dam Busters knew if they strayed off course, they could crash into the side of a mountain.
You've got to have quite an iron stomach because it's quite bouncy down at this level as well. But the wind's following the curves in the ground, just causing all this turbulence. It adds an extra level of complexity and unpleasantness to the navigator's job.
You can imagine trying to do this in a Lancaster. It's hard enough in this aeroplane.
After a few wrong turns and a very bumpy final approach,
There, this is the famous valley now. We found it. We have found it.
we've located our target. This practice run to Derwent was only 40 miles, But to reach the Ruhr Valley Dam's 617 Squadron must navigate low level across 400 miles of heavily defended enemy territory. The squadron now have just 6 weeks until the mission. They've completed 26 daylight navigation practice runs, and also started practicing precision low-level bombing. Because for the bouncing bombs to work, Barnes-Wallis believes they have to be dropped exactly 150 feet above the reservoir at a precise distance from the dam wall. Although the crews still have no idea what their weapon or target are, they do know they'll have to attack over water. So to practice, the crews drop non-bouncing, dummy bombs on Derwent Reservoir. This is where the aircraft are approaching low level, flying at around 240 miles an hour at just 150 feet off the ground or the surface of this water. In the middle there, bobbing, there's a raft, and they have to try and drop the bombs as close to that raft as possible. There's a gentleman here on the side of the reservoir with a pair of binoculars, carefully noting down just how close the bombs get to that raft. But the results are disappointing. The Lancaster's bomb-aiming equipment, designed for use at 15,000 feet, is useless at low levels. And training is about to get even more difficult and dangerous. So far, it's taken place during the day. But Gibson knows that on the mission, they have to fly low level across Europe and drop their bombs at 150 feet, all at night. But he isn't willing to let his aircrews practice this without first attempting it himself. So in late afternoon, he sets off from Scampton with 2 of his most trusted pilots alongside him in the cockpit. Gibson and the other pilots head here to the Derwent Reservoir. It's a hazy day like today, but they manage pretty well flying at 150 feet. They do it again and again. But as nightfall approaches, things get a whole lot more difficult. As the sun sets, Guy Gibson descends one more time, but the blue waters of the reservoir have turned inky black. It's impossible to judge his height. On his last run, Gibson comes in too low. He's just a few feet from the surface of the reservoir, just there. If he hits the water, it's certain death for him and his crew. He realizes his mistake just in time. He pulls the aircraft into a climb. His bomb aimer shouts, "Bloody hell, this is dangerous." The 617 Squadron has just come within a few tenths of a second of losing its squadron commander and 2 of its most senior pilots. Those losses surely would have led to the instant cancellation of the dam's raid. There are still 6 weeks remaining, and the mission is in trouble. 617 are struggling to fly their Lancasters at extremely low level, at night. And they still can't drop their bombs with the necessary precision. It seems an impossible mountain to climb. RAF Scampton, Lincolnshire. The aircrew of newly formed 617 Squadron are in their first week of training for their secret operation. The clock is ticking. Only Squadron Commander Guy Gibson knows the target. All the crews have been told is that the mission requires crossing hundreds of miles of occupied Europe at night, at extreme low level, and they'll have to drop bombs over water with pinpoint precision. Today, 617 are practicing flying at dangerously low levels, far lower than bomber crews ever normally fly.
Throughout the day, the huge Lancaster bombers are roaring down this airstrip and taking to the skies to go flying at treetop height around Britain. The crews have been ordered to fly at 100 feet, but many of the young, thrill-seeking pilots are going much lower than that.
The squadron Gibson has pulled together aren't just young, they're a mix of classes and nationalities. 27-year-old pilot Melvin Dingy Young rode for Oxford and got his nickname after miraculously surviving 2 ditches into the sea. 24-year-old Les Munro is a sheep farmer's son from New Zealand. He's a crack pilot who's just flown underneath another Lancaster, which was only 100 feet from the ground. But low-level flying isn't the only problem on Gibson's mind today. The squadron won't just have to fly low, they'll have to drop their bombs from low heights also, and at exactly the right distance from the targets. In his office, Gibson is trying to work out how on earth they can do it.
There's a knock on Gibson's door. In walks a wing commander he's never met before. His name is Charles Dan, and immediately starts telling Gibson why the bomb-aiming equipment on the Lancasters will be hopeless against the dams. Understandably, Gibson is very sensitive about secrecy, and here's some man he's never met before revealing that he knows all about the targets of this top-secret mission. How the hell do you know all this? Gibson asks him. Dan calms him down. He explains that he's a bomb-aiming expert and he's just been added to the need-to-know list. He goes on to tell Gibson how he's got a remarkably simple solution to the problem of how to bomb accurately at low level.
Dan says that for the bouncing bombs to work, not only do they need to be dropped from precisely 150 feet, but the planes must also be exactly 1,350 feet from the dam. And he's come up with a way for the crews to know when they're at precisely the right distance away. His solution is an astonishingly simple bomb sight.
It's basically just 4 or 5 bits of wood knocked together in the workshop, held together with bolts here, with wing nuts, and with a nail on the end of either arm. The plan was for the bomb aimer to look through here, and when the towers of the dam were aligned to these nails, it was time to drop the bomb because you were the right distance away. Bingo. That's the theory, at least.
That afternoon, Gibson and Dan fly from RAF Scampton to Derwent Reservoir to test out the crude bomb-aiming device. They both know that if the mission's going to succeed, Dan's bomb aimer has to work. With just over 6 weeks left until the mission, Guy Gibson is on his way to Derwent Reservoir. He's been given a new bomb-aiming device to test. It's meant to solve a major problem, telling you when you're exactly the right distance from the dam to drop your bomb, so it'll actually work. Just like Gibson, I'm going to try it out at Derwent Reservoir.
The journey from Scampton to Derwent's about 50 miles. Like Gibson, I've got my primitive bomb-aiming device.
As we crest the hill, we spot the reservoir and dive down towards it.
Imagine trying to do this in a Lancaster. It's hard enough in this aeroplane.
At this height, one mistake by the pilot would be fatal.
And we're doing 200 miles an hour, are we?
Yeah, we're doing about 180 miles an hour.
That's it. We're down at wave top height. We're basically at the same level as the towers on the dam. It's crazy. Here we go. Here we go. That's it, lined up there. Bombs away!
Cool, that was on target within 5 metres. Awesome.
Within 5 metres. That's not bad.
more effective than it looks. That was one of the most amazing and terrifying things I've ever done. It's worked, just like it did for Gibson that day. Amazingly, he now has a simple bomb-aiming device that gives you your distance. And that means one crew member's job has just become even more critical.
Suddenly, on the Dams raid, the bomb aimers became enormously important people. And even if the pilots got it absolutely dead right in the approach to the Mona or the Ada Dams or the Sorpy, they'd achieve nothing unless the bomb aimer pressed his toggle at exactly the right moment.
So the bomb aimer had to have nerves of steel. They had to be patient, they had to be calm under fire, and they had to also have a certain disregard for their own lives.
617 Squadron's bomb aimers now have a way of dropping their bombs at exactly the right distance from the dams. But they still have another massive problem to overcome. And that's the equally difficult and crucial issue of low-level bombing, especially at night. The bouncing bombs have to be dropped from precisely 150 feet above the water. This is astonishingly low and dangerous, and Gibson almost killed himself attempting it a few days earlier. Not only that, the basic instruments in the Lancaster don't give accurate enough height readings. If a solution can't be found, and soon, Gibson knows he's going to have to pull the plug on the whole project. Two days later, Gibson selects pilot Henry Maudsley to make a critical trip to Farnborough. 21-year-old Maudsley is a handsome, rich, old Etonian. And he's just been promoted to joint second-in-command to Gibson. But 2 years flying bomber missions has aged him. Maudsley and the other pilots need to know when they're flying at exactly 150 feet. But the Lancaster's instruments are simply not accurate enough to tell them. Maudsley and the other pilots can't fly low level at night because of this little dial down here, the altimeter. This tells you how high you are flying. And they are not that accurate. They can be up to 30 or 40 feet out, which of course is no problem when you're cruising along at 10,000 feet. But it is a pretty big issue if you're skimming the surface of a reservoir in the middle of the night.
They always knew that getting the height right was absolutely critical. And they did have all sorts of crazy ideas to do with sort of dangling wires out of the plane and so on.
If you dropped the bomb too low, then it wasn't going to have the bouncing effect that it needed. If you then drop it too high, then of course your accuracy can be completely and utterly thrown off.
Then a scientist at the Ministry of Aircraft Production comes up with a potential solution that could be an ultra-accurate alternative to the altimeter. Their ingenious plan is to mount 2 spotlights on either side of the Lancaster at carefully calculated angles. And that meant that as the plane got lower and lower to the ground, it would form a figure of 8 at exactly 150 feet off the surface of the water, the altitude they wanted for dropping the bomb. The theory was that all the crews would now have to do is look out for the spotlights forming a perfect figure of 8 on the water below.
The boffins, the scientists, came up with this idea of the twin lights, which had been used before by Coastal Command for night attacks on U-boats, but it hadn't worked there because the waves on the sea made it too difficult to see the lights. But they figured, and they were right, that on the lakes, flat calm, that it was going to work.
Today, Henry Maudsley is in Farnborough to work out with the engineers how on earth to fix 2 powerful spotlights to the exterior of the Lancasters. After 4 days at Farnborough, Maudsley flies back to Scampton in his Lancaster. He approaches at dusk, at low level, to test the new system. Gibson waits here on the edge of the airfield for Maudsley's return.
Suddenly he sees two thin beams of light in the distance, and a Lancaster bomber emerges from the gloom to roar at low level across this airfield. From where Gibson is standing, it looks as if the plane turns, it will gouge one of its wingtips into the ground, it's so low. Even for an experienced bomber pilot, it's terrifying.
But when Maudsley lands, he gives the thumbs up. Over the next few days, the crews practice using the lights. Within a week, the entire squadron is flying steadily to within 2 feet of the desired height. But there's still one major problem, and that's the bouncing bombs themselves. When they're dropped at the right height and distance, will they actually work? To find out, Gibson, Barnes-Wallis, and various RAF top brass assemble here at Reculver Beach in Kent. The entire area is sealed off and armed guards patrol. The test that's about to take place is as top secret as it gets. Wallis has now finished building a full-size bouncing bomb, and they're all here to see if it works.
Two white aiming boys are bobbing just out there. Then, an adapted Lancaster carrying a full-sized dummy bouncing bomb roars up the coast, flying at low level. For Barnes-Wallis, this was the moment when he was going to find out if years of obsessive work had paid off. It must have been incredibly stressful.
The bomb is released faultlessly. But as it hits the water, the wooden casing shatters and debris is sent in all directions. The bomb doesn't work.
As the foaming sea calms, there is a long, shocked silence. It's only broken when Barnes-Wallis groans, "Oh my God." He looks so distraught, Gibson thinks he's about to have a fit.
Wallis pulls himself together and marches to the shoreline. He rolls up his trousers and wades into the shallows, hunting for fragments of his shattered bomb.
Gibson hears Barnes-Wallis talking to himself. He says, "They said it wouldn't work. They said it was too big and heavy, but I'll show them. I'll strengthen it and we'll have more trials this afternoon."
Barnes-Wallis, either through doggedness or sheer bloody-mindedness, said, "I'm going to prove my doubters wrong."
The next bomb run is scheduled for later that afternoon. As Wallis issues instructions for the bomb's casing to be strengthened, Guy Gibson heads to a nearby RAF airfield to kill time before the next training test. He borrows a small training aircraft and flies back to Reculver to examine the bombing range from above. But en route, something terrible happens. The single engine on his plane comes to a grinding halt.
Gibson searched desperately for somewhere to make an emergency landing. But in this part of Kent, all these fields were full of traps and obstacles designed to prevent invading German troops landing by glider.
Gibson is forced down. His plane strikes an anti-aircraft obstacle and rolls, before coming to a halt in the field. For a moment, all is still. Then, Gibson emerges from the wreckage, completely unscathed.
Even before the dust settles, a local man runs up and starts shouting, "The problem is nowadays they teach young fellas to fly like you far too early." Little did he know, he was talking to one of the most experienced and decorated bomber pilots in the country. Then again, he did also have a point. Gibson was only 24.
Gibson decides not to go to the remaining tests that afternoon. And it saves Wallis more embarrassment, because his hurriedly strengthened bomb also fails to work. Time is running out, and Wallis's bouncing bomb needs a major redesign. 5 days later, Gibson and the RAF's top brass are back at Reculver. Wallace has reinforced his bomb and they're trying again.
Gibson later described Barnes-Wallis at this very moment. He said Barnes-Wallis was standing right on the edge of the water, a nervous energy to him, legs apart, chin jutted out. He said there was an air of fearful expectation about everything.
The first test bomb is dropped. Hits the water, hardly bounces, then sinks. Exactly the same happens with the second. On the third drop, the wooden outer casing yet again disintegrates. But then, something amazing happens. The cylindrical steel core inside bounces on, skipping across the water. This gives Barnes-Wallis an idea. Back at his workshop, he sets to work. And this is what he comes up with. His new design of bouncing bomb, codenamed Upkeep.
This is one of Barnes-Wallis's bouncing bombs. A steel cylinder inside here would have been 3 tons of high explosives. Now, initially, Barnes-Wallis thinks it needs to be a perfect sphere, round ball, for it to bounce like the marble across the surface of the water. But during testing, when he encases this in this wooden ball, as the wood smashes off, he sees that this continues to skip nicely in a straight line. So he decides to dispense with the wood altogether, which means that the Lancaster aircraft will go with this steel cylinder strapped to the underneath.
3 days later, they're back again. This time with Wallace's new cylindrical bomb stripped of its outer casing. Yet again, the great and the good are expectantly looking on. The cylindrical bomb is dropped. It falls perfectly, strikes the water, and sinks immediately, without a single bounce. When news of the failed tests reaches the Commander-in-Chief of Bomber Command, Arthur Harris, he's incandescent with rage.
Bomber Harris didn't want to do the Dam's raid. He'd become already obsessed with his offensive to burn Germany's cities, city by city, to wreck the whole of Germany. He thought that so-called precision bombing, complete waste of time, and all Harris's memos, right through the whole training period, he was always scribbling his intemperate comments on this, saying this is tripe of the wildest kind, it's never going to work, this is crazy. He was not a nice man, Harris, but you need people like that in wars.
On one report, Harris scrawls, "As I always thought, the weapon is balmy. I will not have aircraft flying about with spotlights on in defended areas. Get some of these lunatics controlled and, if possible, locked up."
The raid has to take place in less than a month. If Wallace can't get his giant bomb bouncing properly, the whole thing will have to be cancelled.
Spring 1943. The water in the great German reservoirs is rising, fast approaching the levels needed for Wallace's bomb to be effective. If the raid is delayed, the water will start falling. But that's not the only problem. Wallace still hasn't got his bomb to work at all. As Guy Gibson and the crews of 617 Squadron wait for a working bouncing bomb, they practice dropping non-bouncing bombs at night on low-level runs here at Derwent Reservoir. It's a good substitute for the Mona and Ida dams.
At night, the aircraft come flying down this valley here, only 150 feet above the surface of the reservoir, 200 miles an hour, racing along, and in front of the dam here, there's a raft, about a quarter of a mile out, and they have to drop their bombs as close as possible to that raft, on the bank. There are gentlemen from the Air Force seeing how close they manage to drop their bombs to that raft. The crews often manage to get their bombs within 20 feet of the raft, but things are about to get a whole lot more difficult.
With little over 3 weeks to go, Gibson gets a call. Barnes-Wallis wants to meet him at his workshop at the Brooklands Aircraft Factory. He's got something important to discuss. When Gibson arrives, Wallis tells him he's finally worked out how to make his bombs bounce. But there's a hitch. It's going to be even more dangerous for the crews than they'd already anticipated. And he wants to ask Gibson face to face if they can do it.
Wallis shows Gibson some calculations he's been working on. He's come to the shocking conclusion that for this bomb to bounce properly, to work, it has to be dropped not from 150 feet as they'd hoped, but from 60 feet. He asked Gibson, can you fly 60 feet from the water? Gibson thinks about it. He knows that that's incredibly low. One false move and they're straight into the drink. Then he replies coolly, we'll have a crack at it tonight.
As an aerobatic pilot, I've done some flying at low level, but what I haven't done is flown 60 feet over water at night. And that is just incredible that these guys were expected to go and do that under enemy fire.
And if Gibson had said, I'm terribly sorry, sir, but it can't be done, that would have been a sensible, rational response. Gibson was probably one of the few men in the Royal Air Force who was willing to say, yes, sir, I think we can do it.
Gibson heads back to base to break the news to his men. The Lancaster spotlights are adjusted from 150 feet to converge at just 60. Later that night, 22-year-old Dave Maltby and his crew are sent off to have a go. Maltby, the son of a prep school headmaster, returns saying that 60 feet is very low. Then Gibson takes off to try for himself. He concludes that the spotlight system works well. Now the rest of the crews must learn how to drop bombs at the new ultra-low height. But time is running out. With less than 3 weeks until the raid has to take place, Wallis may have got his bomb to bounce on paper, but he still hasn't proved it for real. He's got one last chance to show his bombs will work, if dropped from just 60 feet.
It's 9:15 in the morning, and Gibson and Barnes-Wallis are back here on Reculver Beach, waiting nervously for the make-or-break test of the modified cylindrical bouncing bomb.
The Lancaster hurtles in, skimming the sea at 60 feet. The bomb is released. It bounces. Once. Then twice. In total, it bounces 6 times. It doesn't travel quite straight, a concern Wallis had about a cylinder rather than a sphere, but it skips across the water for more than 2,000 feet before finally sinking.
Barnes-Wallis was euphoric. The usually calm, buttoned-up, controlled engineer completely let himself go. He started dancing around, waved his hands in the air, then he took out his handkerchief and started waving above his head. Gibson couldn't believe his eyes, but he decided to join the celebrations. He threw his hat in the air and started dancing too.
Wallis had proved his doubters wrong. At last, he had his bouncing bomb. On May the 2nd, after 5 weeks of intense and dangerous training, the strain is showing on the aircrew. Gibson decides to give everyone 2 or 3 days leave. This is completely out of character, because to this point he's been an authoritarian tyrant when it comes to secrecy.
It didn't make him loved, but by gosh, they were frightened of his rage. And he was right to be so strung up, to be so angry, because he knew that their only chance of pulling off this almost impossible feat was if the Germans did not know they were coming.
If the Germans got wind of what was coming for them, then of course they could have rearranged and bolstered their defences.
Exhausted and under immense stress, unlike his men, Gibson doesn't take leave. An angry boil breaks out on his face, and when the doctor recommends 2 weeks' rest, Gibson laughs. That's exactly how long he's got before the most dangerous mission of his life has to go ahead.
He was struggling from a variety of different ailments. So he had hereditary gout, he was struggling with arthritis in his feet from the demands of being a pilot of these heavy bombers. Truth be told, Gibson really shouldn't have been flying.
Gibson is so tough and demanding, it isn't easy for his men to like him. But he always leads from the front, and they respect that.
Gibson never worried about people's feelings. He was concerned with one thing, getting the job done. And whatever it took to do that, he was going to do. A lot of the men who served under him didn't like him. Very tough, very unforgiving to weaker vessels than himself. But if you're going to fight a war, if you're going to wage a bomber offensive, you need a few people like Guy Gibson to do the business for you.
Six days before the raid, the first live upkeep bouncing bombs arrive at Scampton. The squadron is also supplied with concrete-filled practice bombs. At last, the crews now start using these for test runs off the coast of Kent.
Dropping even these non-exploding bombs from 60 feet leads to some very close scrapes.
Henry Maudsley, very good pilot, very brave young man, and he made a slight mistake and allowed the plane to get a bit too close to the water. When he drops his bomb, this great gusher flies up.
It actually envelops the whole of the tail of the aircraft. It was amazing, actually, that the aircraft managed to fly through it. It could quite easily have brought the aircraft down.
I couldn't tell you the levels of respect I have for the 617 Squadron crews that went out to learn this new skill and put it together in such a short period of time, to do it at night and to the level of accuracy required was incredible.
Returning from a practice bomb run, pilot Dave Maltby takes the opportunity to fly low over the house where his heavily pregnant wife Nina is living. For security, 617 Squadron is now confined to camp. So this is as close as the married couple can get. As he swoops low over the house, waggling his wings, Nina takes this photo. She knows her husband is about to take part in a dangerous mission. This may be the last time she sees him. Gibson is confident his crews are ready, even though only half of them have dropped practice bouncing bombs. The weather reports also look favourable, with cloudless, moonlit skies forecast over Germany. But unbeknownst to Gibson, something is happening behind the scenes. The very top brass in Washington and London are arguing over whether the raid should go ahead or be delayed. The fate of the operation hangs in the balance.
As a final training exercise, most of the squadron carry out a full dress rehearsal that night. They follow a route that simulates the trip to Germany and the bombing run against the Great Dams.
21-year-old intelligence officer Faye Gillen is invited to join the crew of Mick Martin on the dress rehearsal. Gibson had started inviting ground crew on flights to supposedly enhance their appreciation of the aircrew's work. It's possibly only a coincidence that many invited flying are young and female. Gillen is invited into the engineer's seat as they rush out over the sea and drop down practically into the water. Her face is pressed to the window as they then swoop back inland, over roofs and houses, and around chimneys and church steeples. When they land, she heads straight to the mess for a beer with the crew. Then Gibson arrives with a beaming face, saying, "Bloody good show, boys." Gibson writes in his logbook, "Full dress rehearsal completely successful."
The next morning, an encrypted message is received from the Air Ministry in London, marked most immediate, most secret. It reads, "Operation Chastise approved. Execute at first suitable opportunity." Gibson is informed that the raid will take place on the following night.
"4 p.m, the day before the raid. Barnes Wallis flies to RAF Scampton to oversee the loading of the bouncing bombs that for years have been his obsession. He and Gibson wander around this hangar, watching the ground crews arm and carry out final preparations on each of the 19 aircraft that will be heading to Germany in a few hours' time. There should be 20 aircraft on the raid, but Maudsley's plane was so badly damaged during the recent training accident, it can't be repaired in time.
For security reasons, the ground crews working in here have been told they're preparing for another training mission. Apart from Gibson, even the air crews don't know that their actual mission is now just hours away. But everybody has a sense that this is the real thing.
The senior pilots are told first. At 6 p.m, Young, the oldest at 27, and Maudsley and Hopgood, both just 21, are called here to the station commander's house. Gibson and Wallis reveal the targets. The meeting continues until midnight.
As they're leaving to go to bed, the station commander pulls Gibson aside and gently breaks some terrible news. Gibson's beloved Labrador has been run over and killed on a road just next to the base. Gibson is obsessed with that dog. It's been his constant friend and companion for 2 years. It's travelled everywhere with him. And now he's lost him. The night before the most difficult and dangerous raid of his career.
Barnes Wallis, not usually a superstitious man, thinks this could be a bad omen and worries what impact it may have on Gibson. Gibson himself puts on a brave face, but later admits to sitting alone in his room into the early hours, feeling very depressed. The morning of the raid, and Gibson is up at 5:30 a.m. He's only had a few hours' sleep. He's suffering from painful gout in his feet and makes his way to the station doctor before breakfast. The other aircrew sleep in, then head to the hangar to inspect their aircraft, each one loaded with a single live bouncing bomb. Mick Martin and his crew clamber on board to inspect their aircraft, codenamed P for Popsy. Somehow, someone inadvertently presses the bomb release button.
The calipers holding onto the bomb, 3 tons of high explosives, suddenly snap back and the bomb crashes on to this floor of the hangar. People run for their lives. Fortunately, the bomb doesn't detonate. If it had blown up, it would have obliterated this hangar and many of the crews of 617 Squadron.
Just before 6 p.m, tannoys around RAF Scampton call the air crews to their pre-mission briefing. The 133 men selected to fly that night assemble. They're about to finally hear details of their mission.
Guy Gibson and Barnes Wallis stand at the front of the room. It's the first time Wallis has seen the faces of the young men, almost all in their early 20s, who'll be risking their lives to carry out his plan. He turns to Gibson and says, "I hope they all come back." Gibson, who knows the reality of the odds that they face, replies, "It won't be your fault if they don't."
Barnes Wallis was strung up like a piano wire, and how could he not be? And now suddenly he sees 150 odd very young men who are going to execute his idea at the risk of their lives.
Until that point in time, he had almost been in control. Upkeep was his baby, he had developed it, and I think that must have been quite a moment for him.
He must have realized at that moment that if his science doesn't work, these young men are going to die. They're going to die in a failed mission, and the failure of the mission is going to be his fault.
In war, the price of failure is paid with lives. And he knew how much was resting on this.
When the target is finally revealed, it's actually a relief for most. They aren't being asked to attack the battleship Tirpitz after all, or the heavily defended U-boat pens in Brittany as they'd feared. The feeling is at least they have a sporting chance. As the men crowd around maps and models of the Mona, Ida and Zorpa dams, their primary targets, they're told the locations of known flak anti-aircraft guns on the long, low-level flight across Germany. Then Gibson briefs them on the plan of attack.
There are 19 aircraft on the raid. They will be divided into 3 different waves. The first wave, led by Guy Gibson himself, will take this southerly route here to attack the Mona Dam. The second wave of 5 aircraft, led by American Joe McCarthy, will take a northerly but shorter route across the coast first and attack the Zorpa Dam. After those aircraft of the first 2 waves have destroyed their targets, hopefully, they will move on to a third dam, the Ida. In this, they will be helped by the third and final wave, the reserves, 5 aircraft who will arrive to finish off any targets not destroyed yet by the first 2 waves.
The men are given the traditional pre-operation meal of bacon and eggs, a luxury in wartime Britain. Then, most of the men return to their quarters to write letters home, in case they don't make it.
One of them, who was a Dambuster wireless operator, Anthony Stone, and he wrote for his parents up in Winchester that if he died over Germany, I will have ended happily. So have no fears of how I ended, as I have the finest crowd of fellows in the world with me. And if the skipper goes, I'll be glad to go with him. He has so much to lose, because his pilot's wife was pregnant. We're all tempted to sort of snigger a bit these days at the word duty, and yet duty was something very real to that generation. And one of the things that's so moving, both about the Dambusters operation and about the whole Bomber Command story, here were all these young men who knew they were likely to die, and yet their sense of duty to their mates in the crew, to the squadron, to the RAF, and to their country.
The men collect their flying kit and parachutes and begin assembling outside the hangar. They lounge on the grass in the warm evening sunshine.
Gibson arrives here at the hangar with his entire aircrew packed into his car. He's exuding an air of relaxed calm, but inside he's as nervous as everybody else. Somebody asks, "Do you need anything?" And he simply replies, "Just a lot of beer for when we get back," and adds grimly, "Hopefully."
Pilots Dave Shannon and Hoppy Hopgood stand behind the hangar smoking and quietly chatting. Hoppy is one of the most experienced veterans in the squadron and has flown dozens of dangerous missions. But he has a sense of foreboding about this one. "I think this is going to be a tough one," he confides to Shannon, "and I don't think I'm coming back." Half an hour later, the crews pile into buses that take them to their waiting Lancaster bombers. A Canadian wireless operator, satirising Churchill's famous speech, chalks on his bomb, "Never has so much been expected of so few." And Gibson and his crew climb into G for George. At precisely 9 p.m, a red flare shoots into the dusk sky. It's the signal for these aircraft to fire up their engines. We can imagine what was going through the heads of these men as the huge Rolls-Royce Merlins roared into life. They've been preparing for this for months, but you can never fully anticipate what the enemy is going to throw at you. RAF Scampton, Lincolnshire. It's Sunday the 16th of May 1943, and as the sun sets, the crews of 19 Lancaster bombers are preparing to take off on one of the most difficult missions of the Second World War, to attack the dams of Germany. But it almost begins with disaster. That evening, the ground crews leave these hangars to watch the first of the Lancasters rumbling up this grass runway and into the dusk sky, the 4 Merlin engines roaring at full power. For secrecy, the ground crew have been told this is just another training mission. But these are the men who'd earlier in the day loaded a massive 4-ton bouncing bomb onto each of the aircraft. So they know, this time it's for real. As they watch the ground crew hold their breath, they notice that one of the Lancasters, codenamed E for Easy, is taking far longer than normal to take off. At the controls, 32-year-old Australian pilot Norman Barlow is struggling to get his aircraft off the ground due to the massive weight of the bouncing bomb. As he hurtles towards the perimeter fence, he has to use all his strength to haul back on the control column. He gets his plane into the air just in time. And there's still another 400 miles to the target. 11 minutes later, 3 more Lancasters take off together. At the controls of one is the mission commander, Guy Gibson. They also struggle to get airborne, but fortunately they make it up safely, as do all the other bombers. Despite the intense training and preparation, none of the 133 aircrew knew exactly what was in store for them, but they'd soon find out. Within an hour, the men of 617 Squadron were under heavy enemy fire. The 19 bomber crews are attacking the German dams in 3 waves. The first wave of 9 is led by Guy Gibson. They're taking a southerly route across Holland to strike the primary target, the Möhne Dam. If successful, they'll fly on to attack the Eder Dam. The second wave of 5 aircraft is taking a more northerly route and bombing the Sorpe Dam. A third, reserve wave of 5 aircraft will take off later. About 20 minutes after takeoff, the lead aircraft reach the English coast, then drop down to wave-top height. First over the North Sea is the aircraft W for Willie, part of the Northern Wave, headed to the Sorpe Dam. It's piloted by Les Munro, a 24-year-old sheep farmer's son from rural New Zealand. He's flying on the edge of what's possible.
The pilots had to maintain radio silence. They had to fly at a low altitude to avoid radar. If they were heard or they were seen, the Germans would scramble fighter pilots and fighter aircraft, and they would shoot those Lancaster bombers out of the sky.
Crossing the North Sea was an epic in itself because they were doing it at such a low level. And you only needed the slightest lapse of concentration and you were in the drink.
The 7 aircrew in Les Munro's Lancaster each have a critical role. As Munro approaches the enemy coast, he knows it's the skill of his Scottish navigator, Francis Rumbles, that will keep them alive.
If you just had a bit of a variation of wind speed, your navigator's a bit off course, then suddenly you find yourself over a German flak battery and being shot to pieces.
It's nearly 11 p.m, and the northerly wind is stronger than forecast. Les Munro's experienced crew corrects for the extra drift, and they cross the Dutch coast over the island of Vlieland as planned. As he skims over the sand dunes, Munro looks to the right and he sees a burst of anti-aircraft flak, followed by a huge explosion. He realises that one of the other aircraft must have been blown too far to the south, strayed over a heavily defended island, and paid a terrible price. It's flown by Vernon Byers. It's only Byers' 6th mission, and he's the squadron's least experienced pilot. His bouncing bomb is hit and explodes. Byers and his entire crew are killed. Then Munro hears a crack behind him and his headphones go dead. The island that he's just correctly overflown was supposed to be undefended, but it wasn't. Now shells rip through his aircraft. One severs their intercom and radio cables. There's no way they can continue the mission without being able to communicate. Then, as Munro is forced to turn for home, a 3rd Lancaster hits trouble. Jeff Rice, flying H for Harry, misjudges his height over the sea. In the rear turret, his gunner, Sergeant Burns, feels a violent jolt and is suddenly submerged up to his waist in seawater. It drains away slowly as the plane climbs, but as he turns around to take stock, he looks forward and he sees that the upkeep bouncing bomb isn't there. As they'd clipped the sea, their bomb had been ripped off. Miraculously, they can still fly, but with no bomb, H for Harry also begins the journey home. Within just a few minutes of the first 3 aircraft reaching the enemy coast, 2 are returning home damaged and 1 has been destroyed. The remaining 16 crews now face hundreds of miles of low-level flying above occupied Europe before they even reach the dams. And not all of them will return. .617 Squadron's commander, Guy Gibson, is approaching the Dutch coast. Flying in formation with him are Hoppy Hopgood in M for Mother and Mick Martin in P for Popsy. These 3 are heading to attack the main target, the Moona Dam. They also experience strong winds and are blown south. As they sweep across the enemy coast at less than 50 feet, they fly straight into a heavily defended area. Hopgood's rear gunner, Tony Bircher, is thinking about his fiancée. They're due to marry in just a few weeks. He's jolted back to reality as his aircraft is caught in enemy searchlights. Hopgood weaves violently to avoid the anti-aircraft fire arcing up towards them. Thrown around in his rear turret, just a few feet above the ground, Bircher is convinced that they're going to crash.
Suddenly, above his head whizzes a high-voltage electricity cable and disappears off into the distance. Hopgood throws the plane into a climb. "Right under the bloody things!" shouts the front gunner on the intercom. Hopgood replies, cool as anything, "Sorry about that."
Gibson, Hopgood and Martin amazingly thunder on unscathed, skimming over the trees and rooftops of Nazi-occupied Holland. As Gibson crosses the enemy coastline, Barnes Wallis, the designer of the bouncing bomb, is arriving at the headquarters of Bomber Command's 5 Group at St Vincent's Hall, Grantham.
Here, Wallace joins the boss of Bomber Command, Sir Arthur Harris. The control room was on this spot, just outside that window, but it's since been demolished.
They nervously wait for the first radio messages from the bombers, who'll only break radio silence once the attack begins.
Back at the operations room in Grantham, you could cut the tension with a knife. You had Wallace, you had Harris, you had all of these top personnel listening in very, very nervously to the radio. And of course, there wasn't any communication as the Lancasters flew out. So it really was this tense bubble of not knowing which way this raid was going to go.
Barnes Wallis paces continuously up and down. Only that morning, he'd seen the faces of the young men for the first time. Young men that were now risking their lives to execute his plan to destroy the dams. He didn't know, of course, thanks to radio silence, but by now, 7 of those young men are already dead.
The lead bombers are now just 25 minutes from their target. The first to cross into Germany itself is E for Easy, flown by Norman Barlow, the son of a wealthy, though rather shady, Australian businessman. It's one of only 2 planes remaining from the 5 who should be attacking the Zorpa Dam.
Just moments after crossing the border at low level, E for Easy crashes into the very top of a 100,000-volt electricity pylon, bursts into flames and crashes in a field. Barlow and his 6-man crew are killed instantly.
Their bouncing bomb somehow survives the crash intact. No one realizes it yet, but the Germans are now in possession of Britain's new top-secret weapon. Only 1 aircraft from the northern Zorpa Dam wave now remains, flown by American pilot Joe McCarthy. He and his crew have no idea they're flying to the dam alone. To the south, the 9 aircraft led by Guy Gibson and Hoppy Hopgood are enjoying a relatively uneventful flight across Holland. But then they cross the German border. In the lead are Gibson and Hopgood. As they reach the Rhine, they discover they've strayed off course by 6 miles due to a mistake by the navigator. Now they're dangerously close to one of the thickest belts of anti-aircraft guns in Germany, protecting the Reich's industrial heartland, the Ruhr Valley.
Hopgood's rear gunner, Tony Bircher, is briefly blinded as searchlights illuminate the aircraft. Then it's peppered from nose to tail by anti-aircraft fire. He's wounded in the groin and the stomach, but just lightly, and he's able to continue returning fire on the searchlights.
The wireless operator suffers a terrible injury to his leg, and the front gunner is killed. Hopgood is also wounded. Despite blood pouring from a cut to his head, he manages to shut down the left outer engine, which has caught fire.
Over the intercom here in the rear turret, Bircher hears the flight engineer shout, "Christ, look at all that blood!" Then he hears Hopgood's calm reply, "Carry on, and don't worry. I'm okay." Astonishingly, they don't turn back, but limp on towards their target. At midnight, Guy Gibson and his crew arrive over the vast Mona Reservoir. Flying alongside are Mick Martin and Hoppy Hopgood, who's now down to just 3 engines. Then Gibson catches sight of the dam. It looks squat, heavy and unconquerable, grey and solid in the moonlight. 6 more aircraft are due to join them, but Gibson doesn't know that one of them has just been destroyed. It has crashed into power lines. A third crew of 7 are all killed. The death toll has now reached 21, and only 14 of the original 19 aircraft remain. The bomber's arrival at the Mona doesn't go unnoticed. Multiple anti-aircraft guns open fire as they circle the dam. After surveying the landscape, Gibson breaks radio silence and calls to the other aircraft. "Well, boys, I suppose we'd better start the ball rolling. I'm going into attack."
You have to empathise with this very young man at that moment when all the others are circling, watching, and he's got to, from beginning to end, show them how to do it.
Before they could actually start the bombing run along the reservoir towards the dams, they had to get the bomb spinning. When the bomb was spinning at 500 RPM, you could really feel it, and there were stories of being bounced around just like being in turbulence.
Gibson dives down towards the reservoir to make his attack. As they drop down over the water, Gibson's navigator turns on the 2-light system, then he peers out this special window here looking at the surface of the reservoir. He guides him ever further down. Down, 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 he says. Then, when the perfect figure of 8 shows on the surface of the water at 60 feet exactly, he says, "Steady, steady." Manning a gun on the dam is SS flak gunner Karl Schutt, the 23-year-old son of a local farmer. He's received warning of the raid, so along with the other gunners, he's waiting. Schutt hears Gibson's bomber approaching, roaring towards him like a beast. So low, he's convinced it'll crash into the dam. Finally, he sees the Lancaster and opens fire. Gibson sees the shells hurtling past his windows. His front gunner opens up, returning fire. Then from under his feet, Gibson hears the voice of his bomb aimer. He's got his crude sight lined up on the dams. He shouts, "Left of it! Steady! It's coming up!" And finally, bomb's gone. The bomb bounces perfectly, then skips over the moonlit reservoir, but doesn't quite make it to the dam wall. As Gibson's aircraft skims the top of the dam and climbs away, the bomb sinks, then explodes. A massive column of water shoots up, rising 1,000 feet into the air. On the dam wall, Karl Schutt feels the dam shake beneath him like an earthquake. Then a huge wave of water sweeps over the wall. But the dam still stands. A coded message of the failure is sent back to the Bomber Command Operations Room, where Barnes Wallis, already in a high state of anxiety, mutters in despair, "No,
It's no good.
Barnes-Wallis thought that one bomb would do it, that would be sufficient to breach the dam. There must have been a very low moment for everybody concerned. Perhaps the whole mission was a waste of time, and perhaps the lives had been shed in vain.
Gibson now sends Hopgood into attack. He's no idea his friend is injured and his aircraft badly damaged.
It's a piece of cake.
Gibson tells him over the radio.
Hopgood was a very brave, very dedicated young man whom Gibson regarded as the best pilot on the squadron.
The bravery of 617 as a whole is immense, but Hopgood stands out above the rest of them. By the time he'd reached the dams, he was down to 3 engines, and he still went in to his run to attack.
Hopgood now thunders towards the dam. The German gunners have learned from the first attack, and their fire is much more accurate. Hopgood's aircraft is peppered with bullets. Stunned for a moment, his bomb aimer releases his bomb a fraction too late. It bounces once, flies over the dam, and explodes beneath.
Hopgood's rear gunner, Bircher, hears on the intercom, bomb's gone. But there wasn't too much time to celebrate because he sees out of his window sheets of flame coming past. And he hears the engineer shout, "We're on fire." With great difficulty, he extracts himself from his tiny turret. There isn't room in there for his parachute, so he grabs his parachute on the way by, crawls down here, and then decides to plug into the intercom here. He says, "How's it going up front?" Hopgood shouts, "Get out, you bloody fool."
Hopgood tries to climb high enough so the crew can bail out, but his aircraft is too badly damaged.
Bircher opened this hatch, and then he sees the wireless operator crawling towards him, badly injured, his leg's nearly severed. So he picks him up and throws him out of the aircraft, just pulling his parachute's ripcord as he does so. Then he looks down, he sees the treetops below. There isn't enough height, so he pulls his own ripcord inside the plane and throws his parachute out as a bundle and hops out after it.
Bircher breaks his back, but miraculously survives. The 21-year-old bomb aimer, Fraser, also manages to bail out successfully. The rest of the crew don't make it. Hoppy Hopgood stays at the controls until M for Mother crashes into the trees.
And then it's Mickey Martin's turn, this wild Australian, wild on the ground, brilliant pilot in the air, the low-flying specialist. And Martin's bomb bounces just offline, explodes, nothing happens. So you there had the 3 best pilots in 617 Squadron have dropped their upkeeps and they've all failed.
Then Gibson orders Dingy Young to attack and courageously flies alongside him to draw away the flak. Young drops his bomb perfectly, but again, the dam still holds. As Dingy Young's 4th attack again fails to destroy the Mona Dam, 10 miles away, American Joe McCarthy is attempting to attack the Zorpa Dam. McCarthy and his crew don't know that they're the only bomber left of the 5 assigned to attack the Zorpa. And it's the hardest dam of all to breach, because it's an earthen dam, a massive bank of soil with a concrete core, making it more robust even than the Mona.
They made their first run along the dam, and it's a shambles. First of all, they nearly fly into the wood on the other side, and secondly, they're far too high, and it's a mess. So they go round, and they do it again, and it's still a mess. And they go around again, and here you are, you're in the middle of Germany. You've got everybody in the local village on the telephone asking, where are the night fighters? Where are the Luftwaffe? Finally, it's only after 10 runs that the bomb aimer at last presses the toggle and releases the bomb, which landed almost perfectly along the dam wall. It explodes perfectly. But the Sorpe is a huge earth dam, and it doesn't break the dam.
617 Squadron has now been attacking the dams for 20 minutes. They've managed to drop 5 upkeep bombs, but the price has been terribly high, and the dams still stand.
Guy Gibson and his crew, along with 6 other Lancaster bombers, have now been attacking the Möhne Dam for half an hour. They've dropped 4 bouncing bombs on the dam, but it's still standing.
What those young men must have felt. They'd given it their absolute best shot. They'd done it so nearly right, and yet so nearly right wasn't enough.
Guy Gibson now calls J for Johnny to make their attack. The pilot is 23-year-old David Maltby. As Maltby makes his approach, Gibson and Mick Martin circle the dam, firing on the enemy guns. On the dam, flak gunner Karl Schutt can't fire back. His gun has seized, and the one in the other tower has been destroyed in an earlier attack. Only one small machine gun is still firing.
Schutt stands on the dam and waits for the end. As Maltby's aircraft roars down over the reservoir, he feels it's almost so close he can reach out and touch it. He can even make out the outline of the pilot's head.
As Maltby approaches the dam, he can see its top is already crumbling. Young's previous bomb had in fact caused a small breach. Maltby releases his bomb. It bounces 4 times. Overhead, the other crews watch anxiously as the bomb strikes the dam dead center, sinks, and explodes.
On the dam, Schutt feels the ground shake again. Another massive column of water goes up into the air. Waves come cascading over the parapet and soak him. But this time, the water doesn't stop flowing.
The spray from the blast obscures Gibson's view of the dam. He's about to order yet another attack, when someone shouts over the radio,
I think she's gone.
Gibson flies closer and sees the entire center of the dam, 100 meters long, has collapsed. Millions of gallons of water are sweeping down the valley.
The Möhne Dam has been breached. Once Gibson's crew have stopped screaming in celebration, he reports the success back to headquarters.
Very seldom in the Second World War was there a moment at which the mood changed so quickly in a command headquarters from the depths of despair to the summits of exultation. Bomber Harris, the skeptic, of course embraces success, and he goes straight to Wallace and he said, Wallace, when you first came to me with this idea, that I didn't believe in it for a moment, but now you could sell me a pink elephant.
But the mission's far from over. The 3 aircraft that haven't yet used their bombs now fly 50 miles from the Möhne to their next target, the Eder Dam. Gibson and his second-in-command, Dingy Young, go with them to direct the attack. In 1943, the Eder is the biggest dam in Europe, the pride of Germany. It's a symbol of their engineering prowess and power. 119 feet thick at its base and 138 feet high. Its 17-mile-long reservoir contains 1.5 times more water even than the Mona. Its destruction will strike a devastating blow to German morale.
Fog has built up in the valleys. Gibson is struggling to find the massive dam. He flies along the reservoir for 5 minutes before he eventually spots it.
Fortunately, there are no defending anti-aircraft guns. But that's because the area is so hilly, the Nazis think it's impossible for any bomber to make an attack.
You had this very narrow approach to the dam, and then just past the dam, you've got this almost wall of rock. So you've got to make a steep approach, you've got to hit your height right, and then the moment you've dropped the bomb, you've got to climb flat out, or you're going to go straight into the wall of rock.
L for Leather is the first aircraft to attack. Unable to get down to 60 feet in time because of the hills, they make multiple failed attempts. Finally, they drop their bomb. It hits the center of the dam perfectly and explodes. But the dam holds. And there are now only 2 bombs remaining at the Ida. Next, Gibson orders the 21-year-old Old Etonian Henry Maudsley to attack.
Henry Maudsley's bomb drops too late. There may have been something wrong with the trigger mechanism. As a result, it bounces once, then it smashes into the parapet of the dam. The weight of that impact means it explodes immediately. And that explosion then catches Maudsley's plane as it shoots low over the dam itself.
Gibson radios.
Henry, you okay?
He receives a faint reply.
I think so. Stand by.
Then nothing more. Henry Maudsley and his crew aren't okay. 40 minutes later, their damaged, burning aircraft proves easy prey for German gunners near the Dutch border. No one survives. There's now only 1 aircraft left at the Ida with a bomb. It's their last chance to break the dam. N for Nuts, flown by 22-year-old Australian Les Knight. A deeply religious Methodist, this quiet, meticulous man is a non-drinker who avoids the beer-fueled social life of the squadron. Despite the immense pressure, Knight and his crew drop the bomb perfectly, and it strikes the Ida Dam dead center.
As Knight climbs steeply to avoid the high ground in front of him, the bomb explodes. Gibson, who's flying just above Knight, looks back and sees the base of the dam has been blown away. It looks like, he says, a gigantic hand has punched through cardboard.
A 30-foot-high tidal wave thunders down the valley, sweeping away the cars, buildings, bridges, and people below.
The deluge coming from the breached dams is absolutely colossal, this sort of roaring power that's pushing everything in its path downriver.
The fact of there's something like 1,400 people who died, a large proportion of them women slave laborers who were no friends of Hitler, who were friends of the Grand Alliance and Hitler's slaves. It was a huge human catastrophe alongside a great triumph of British technology and British courage.
As floods cascade down the valleys, the 5 aircraft of the reserve wave are still making their way low level towards Germany.
The reserve wave didn't achieve much, and they also suffered very heavily. One got lost and turned back without dropping his bomb. one did drop his bomb, and to this day nobody's quite sure which dam he dropped his bomb on.
Tragically, 2 of the reserve aircraft are shot down on their way to the Zorba.
Brownie and Freddy did make an incredibly brave attempt to break the Sorpy, following Joe McCarthy, but again it failed to break the dam.
12 surviving crews now have to get home. As dawn approaches, the skies lighten and they lose their protective cover of darkness. They can be seen by the German fighters. On top of that, they've lost the element of surprise. The Germans know only too well where they are.
The 12 surviving dam-buster crews are racing home at extreme low level across Nazi-occupied Europe. The 5 aircraft that attacked the Ida Dam have reached Holland. Dingy Young is approaching the Dutch coast. He and Gibson are the pilots who've spent most time over enemy territory. As Dingy crosses the coastline, he knows they're now as good as home.
The other pilots think that Dingy Young flies too high. Yes, it's easy to navigate and avoid hitting things on the ground, but it makes you very visible. And sure enough, as Dingy Young takes his aircraft roaring out over the coast of Holland towards the North Sea, he's hit by anti-aircraft fire from the ground. This time, there's no miraculous sea rescue for Dingy Young. He and his crew are killed instantly when their Lancaster crashes into the sea.
At RAF Scampton, the ground crews have been waiting up all night for the attackers' return. First home is Mick Martin in P for Popsy. The 3rd pilot to attack the Mona, he's been at the controls now for 5 hours and 40 minutes. 23-year-old Maltby, whose bomb broke the Mona, lands immediately afterwards. They're elated.
Someone asks Maltby how it went. Marvellous, absolutely marvellous, he enthuses. Water, water everywhere. I've never seen anything like it in my life. But then his tone changes. Hoppies bought it, he says. Shot down over the target. Some of them never even got there.
As dawn brightens over Scampton, more survivors limp home. Almost every aircraft has damage. After 6.5 hours in the air, Gibson lands at 4:15 a.m. At 6:15 a.m., the final plane arrives home, flown by Townsend. By this time, Barnes Wallis and Bomber Harris have arrived at Scampton from headquarters.
As the exhausted Townsend clambers out of his aircraft, there's a large crowd waiting to hear how it's gone. One senior officer in particular steps forward, asking him what happened. He just pushes past him, saying, "Wait till the debrief." Only later does he realise that man was Bomber Harris.
Guy Gibson and the other survivors have already headed here to the officers' mess, where a party is underway in the bar. Later in the morning, the party moves on here to the station commander's house, where Barnes Wallis is staying. Wallis is seen emerging from his room in a dressing gown, with tears in his eyes. He's devastated by the loss of life that has resulted from his project. Gibson tries to comfort him, unsuccessfully.
Of the 133 men who went on the raid, only 80 survived, and 3 of them were prisoners in German hands. It was a shockingly high price to pay. Following the early morning party, the surviving pilots gather here in front of the officers' mess for a group photo. On the end stands Anderson, the reserve pilot who'd got lost and turned back without dropping his bomb. To Gibson, it's unacceptable. Soon after this photo is taken, Gibson throws Anderson out of 617 Squadron and sends him from Scampton in disgrace. Over in Germany, Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, is woken and told of the raid. He flies over the broken dams, then lands to inspect the damage.
Albert Speer sees these great sheets of water extending over farmland and villages and towns. Speer was absolutely devastated. The shock to the Nazi leadership is hard to overstate.
The dams raid struck so much fear into the heart of the Nazi leadership because they had never anticipated a challenge and a blow to that kind of scale. And Joseph Goebbels, who was Hitler's spin doctor, had once commented that the English have never invented anything original. But this time they had.
As the exhausted crews finally head to bed, news of the attack breaks. It marks a turning point in the war for Britain, supplying a much-needed morale boost for people who've been fighting for 4 years.
Although the results of the deluge in the short term were undeniably impressive for the British, it didn't really have the lasting impact and the knockout blow that Wallace was anticipating, so everything was repaired relatively quickly.
By the time the autumn rains came, the Mona Dam and the Mona Reservoir were back in business serving rural industry. The biggest mistake made by the British, if they'd bombed the dam repairs, then they could have transformed the attack on the Mona and the Ada from just an inconvenience and a shock to Germany into a really serious blow to rural industry. But they failed to do this.
The aircrew who survived the raid are given a week's leave, but soon they're flying again. Of the 77 young men that returned from the Dam Busters raid that morning, 32 of them would be killed in action before the end of the Second World War. David Maltby, whose bomb breached the Mona Dam, died, along with his entire crew, 4 months after the Dam Busters raid. Most of Gibson's crew died the day after Maltby, but Gibson himself was on a publicity tour of the USA by then. Anderson, the disgraced pilot, and his entire crew were killed 8 days later. Barnes Wallis never got over the loss of life brought about by his idea. He'd forever refused to answer when asked how he felt about the men who died that night. Guy Gibson was taken off frontline duties, but on the 19th of September 1944, he chose to lead a raid over Germany, and coming back, flying low level over Holland, he crashed and was killed. Only 48 of the 133 dam busters would survive the Second World War.